On November 29, 1947, the United States supported the United Nations resolution calling for the partition of the geographic area known as Palestine, which the British had occupied since the end of World War I, having taken it over from the Ottomans, who had control over it since the early 17th century. Now, within 6 months, on May 14, 1948, the British were scheduled to leave Palestine, but during those 6 months, pressure mounted within the United States government against American recognition of the new Jewish state. The State Department lined up against it. General George Marshall, then Secretary of State, the most famous public figure in the United States, he warned President Truman that if he recognized the new Jewish state, he would resign and campaign against him. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, he argued that the Jewish state would need the protection of 160,000 American troops, and this was unacceptable. Under this immense pressure, Harry Truman relented. And by February of 1948, the United States had given up its plan to support this Jewish state. All of this is documented in both the Truman Papers and a book called A Case of Courage. Now, the Zionist movement sent every envoy, pulled every string, exerted every effort to change the president's mind, having remained too silent during the Holocaust. Jewish leaders would not sit quietly while this opportunity passed. But Truman was the kind of man who, when pushed, became only more stubborn. He wrote in his diaries, quote, "You cannot satisfy the Jews. The Jews have no sense of proportion, nor do they have any judgment of world affairs. The Jews, I find, are very, very selfish. The Jews aren't going to write the history of the United States or my history," he said. Now, Harry Truman would eventually ban Zionist leaders from his office. He wasn't overtly anti-Semitic. He absorbed the cultural attitudes of the American heartland where he was born. He was married to a woman who personified the closed-mindedness and bigotry of that environment. Bess Truman, his wife, never allowed a Jew into their home, just as her mother had never allowed a Jew into her home. Now, back in 1917, Lieutenant Harry Truman, he wrote his then-girlfriend Bess Wallace, who would obviously become Bess Truman, that he had a new crackerjack Jew clerk running his canteen named Eddie Jacobson. Now, Jacobson and Truman, they become close friends, opened a business together in Kansas City, and as Lieutenant Truman became Senator Truman, who would become President Truman, the two stayed close, always making time for a bourbon and a poker game when Truman was in town. It was a special friendship, both would admit, but a friendship that didn't include their wives and families, couldn't include their wives and families because of Bess. But it was anchored to something lasting and meaningful. So when the administration withdrew its support for this Jewish state, Jewish leadership became desperate, and rumor of this quiet friendship between Truman and Jacobson surfaced. Now, at first, Jacobson was cautious, reluctant about helping. But it quickly became clear that the fate of the Jewish state, and in many ways the fate of the Jewish people, it hinged on whether President Harry Truman would say yay or nay on May 14, 1948, and Jacobson had a role to play. Jacobson was told that the only man who had the ability to persuade a yay vote was Chaim Weizmann, a man who would later become the first president of Israel. And he was old and sickly and frail, and Weizmann had traveled to New York to see Truman, but the president had refused him, and Jacobson wired his old friend, quote, "I've asked very little in the way of favors during all our years of friendship, but I'm begging you now to see Dr. Weizmann." But the president responded that the Palestine situation was unsolvable. Refusing to give up Jacobson, he arrived at the White House, uninvited, on March 13, 1948, to talk with the president personally. And after waiting hours, Truman called him into the Oval Office with a warning. "Eddie, I know what you're doing here, and the answer is no." And when Jacobson asked him to reconsider, Truman exploded in a tirade against the Eastern Jews who slandered and libeled him. He didn't want to discuss Jews or Arabs or the British, and Jacobson was stunned. But Jacobson was persistent, and knowing Truman better than most, was able to change his friend's mind. And on Thursday, March 18, 1948, after dark, Chaim Weizmann was slipped into the Oval Office, and no one knows what was said between the two men. But on Friday evening, May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion read Israel's Declaration of Independence, establishing the Jewish state. And 11 minutes later, by order of President Harry Truman, the United States of America recognized Israel's independence. Now, asked later why he defied his own State Department, Truman responded, quote, "The ultimate test of a decision is not whether it's popular at the time, but whether it's right. And if it's right, make it, and let the popular part take care of itself." If it's right, make it, and let the popular part take care of itself. Now, 3 weeks ago, I understood that story quite differently than I do today. I understood that in 1948, Eddie Jacobson channeled the legacy of Queen Esther, using his relationship with a person in a position of power to lobby and affect change on behalf of what was right, what was necessary for the Jewish people. When Mordecai pleaded with Queen Esther to approach the king in an effort to stop the edict made against the Jews in the story of Purim, she refused initially. She questioned her ability to persuade the king, noting that such audacious questioning of policy was dangerous. It could lead to her expulsion from the kingdom or worse. And to this Mordecai, he famously said the following: Ki im achreish tachrishi ba'et hazot, revach v'tzala ya'amol liYudim b'makom acher, va'at u'beit avicha tovedu, u'mi yodea, im le'et kazot igat lemalchut. But if you remain silent at this time, will relief and deliverance arise for the Jews from somewhere else? You, your father's house, you'll still be destroyed. And who knows? Who knows whether you've come to the kingdom just to be there at this time? Now Mordecai was unrelenting, explaining to Esther that the fortuitous journey of her life had led her to this crossroads, that her ascension to royalty was for no other purpose than to be in the right place at the right time to save the Jewish people. Now Eddie Jacobson, he balked. He balked initially at the request to speak to Harry Truman to break their friendship's only rule. But what if he was silent in this moment? What if those years as a clerk in World War I, the business venture, the years of shared bourbons and poker games and banter, what if all of it was so he could be at the right place at the right time to forever change the trajectory of Jewish history? Now, 3 weeks ago, the United States Jewish community was filled with Eddie Jacobson's courageous Jews risking relationships by pleading with and petitioning friends in positions of power, decision makers for this country, to do the right thing for the sake of the future of the Jewish people, to do the right thing when it came to the Iran deal. Now, for Jews, the Iran deal transcended political affiliation, was an existential matter of life and death. Each of us, a version of Mordecai seeking out today's Queen Esther, a queen who would be able to convince the king to do the right thing, to stop a modern-day Haman from destroying the Jews, and the Western world for that matter. Now the problem, my friends, the problem was that we couldn't agree on what was right for the Jews. We were force-fed analysis by every news media outlet regarding breakout times, snapback mechanisms, centrifuges. We regurgitated rhetoric and data about what we thought to be the right thing for the Jews, but for some of us, it was supporting the deal. For others of us, it was opposing the deal. Now to put it very, very simply, some people, they react to a sign that reads 50% off by thinking, I've waited for this. I've wanted this for years. It may still be well out of my price range, but it's 50% off. What a deal. I may not actually be able to afford it. It may even hurt me in the long run, but I'll never see 50% off again, and I have to take it. Now others react to that same 50% off sign by thinking, I've wanted this for years, but even marked down 50%, it's too much for me. Better not to have it at all than to pretend I can afford it just because it says 50% off. There's got to be another way to find something similar, maybe even better, but at a price that won't hurt me in the long run. Now listen to the language of a full-page ad taken out in the New York Times by the National Jewish Democratic Council. Quote, each of us has devoted decades to building and enhancing Israel's security and strengthening the United States-Israel alliance. Our commitment to Israel is everlasting, while not perfect. This deal is the best available option to halt Iran's nuclear weapons program, end quote. Now contrast that with the language of the following statement by the ADL. The agreement pauses but does not stop Iran's nuclear weapons program and thereby keeps the threat alive, and our concern is that the agreement will bolster the legitimacy and stability of a hostile Iranian regime, and we therefore oppose it. In short, my friends, no deal is better than a bad deal, and similar statements were made by many Jewish federations, Bnai Brit, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, American Jewish Committee, AJC, and of course, AIPAC. Now, the divide amongst us only grew in toxicity. After Jerry Nadler, Democratic representative from New York, after he announced his support for the deal, his Facebook page was flooded with vitriol. He was called a capo, a name for Jews who collaborated with the Nazis in World War II. He was told that the blood of Jewish people would forever stain his hands. And worst of all, he was told that a future Holocaust museum would list him as a shameful collaborator of a deal that sealed the fate of the Jews. Now, on the other side of this debate, Senator Chuck Schumer, also Democrat, also from New York, he opposed the deal. He was called a traitorous rodent, a Netanyahu marionette, a disloyal American. Now, in 1948, the Jewish community was so unified as to what was good for the Jewish people, what was right for the Jewish people, it successfully coordinated the push to convince Truman to endorse the Jewish state. But in 2015, we were so polarized and combative as to what was good and right for the Jews, we may have burned that date, 2015, into the collective memory of the Jewish people alongside 1939, 1881, 1649, 1492, 1096, and 70. And our grandchildren may indict us, judge us, the same way we indict and judge the generation of the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Now, while it was the Roman Empire who burned Jerusalem to the ground, the catalyst for that catastrophic trauma was something entirely different. Why, asked the Talmud, was the Second Temple destroyed in 70 CE? Given that Jews were studying Torah, performing mitzvot, engaging in acts of loving kindness and charity, just like we do. Because of sinat chinam, says the Talmud, baseless hatred amongst Jews. And what was baseless hatred amongst Jews? Listen to this. Our sages suggest it was the systemic spread of excessive righteousness. Righteous individuals who treated others who disagreed with them, others who didn't conform to their beliefs, as heretics. What one Jew thought to be right for the Jews, another Jew saw as heresy. What one Jew saw as heresy, another Jew saw as being right for the Jews. Sound familiar? Should. If 2015 is burned into the timeline of Jewish history as a year of catastrophe, it will be as much because of our inability to sift through the political spats in Washington and recognize collectively what is right for the Jews. And I say this because the Iran nuclear deal is all but a reality. It's set to be implemented in early 2016, and now, the proverbial day after, now is when the real work for us begins, and the sinat chinam that diseased the Jewish community on account of this deal must be healed. On this day, Yom Hadin, the day of judgment, we must recognize that we are all, every single one of us, accountable for what happens next. A fractured and thus weaker Jewish community today will be the death knell of our grandchildren's Jewish community tomorrow. And here's why. The Iran deal was finalized on July 14th. One of CNN's first headlines, moments after the agreement was announced, then instantly spun through the web of social media and other news agencies, was the following: $2 gas will be back after the Iran deal. Now, the validity of the prediction, or others like it, is irrelevant. What is relevant about that headline, with celebrations about gas prices or possible business ventures, underscores for us Jews, what will always matter about this deal is that it's different for us than it is for everybody else, period. The Iran deal is different for the Jews than everybody else. Now, Naomi, my oldest daughter, God willing, will be 20 in 2030. I celebrated my 20th birthday in Eilat, Israel. For her 20th birthday, 15 years from now in 2030, Iran's obligation to keep uranium enrichment below 3.67% and 300 kilograms ends. Iran's commitment not to acquire plutonium or uranium metals ends. Iran's commitment to allowing IAEA continuous monitoring of stored centrifuges and infrastructures ends. And this unintelligible list goes on and on and on, so I'll say it differently. If my daughter, like her father, celebrates her 20th birthday in Israel, it could be a very different type of day for her. Because breakout time for a nuclear bomb will be zero. And Iran will be a 15-year more sophisticated and powerful country, and that's if they comply with every dotted I and crossed T of that deal. My children, my grandchildren, your grandchildren are at risk. And please don't sit there thinking, oh, I'm not a rabbi. The likelihood of my children studying in Israel or making aliyah is very, very low. Living outside the borders of the Jewish state does not make us immune to Iranian terror. Just ask the families of the 85 victims of the JCC bombing in Argentina, a bombing perpetrated by Hezbollah, one of dozens of terror attacks funded by Iran. In fact, almost every name brand organization you've ever heard inserted into the statement has claimed responsibility for the attack is funded by Iran. Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Houthis, the Taliban, just to name a few. And as sanctions are lifted and Iran gradually shimmies its way back into the international economic sphere, those proxy organizations dedicated to murdering Jews are likely to get stronger, But my friends, it will not happen overnight. Nor will Iran suddenly disengage from the agreement, nuclear weapon in hand. And that's where our role becomes significant. America's attention span is shorter than a toddler's, with today's headline becoming tomorrow's back page and next week's recycling. And this deal is a quarter century long. It requires 25 years of our undivided attention and vigilance. Now, what is going to happen if Iran violates the deal, say, 4 years from now? And by violate the deal, I don't mean that they build a nuclear weapon. I mean they get caught falsifying specimens of uranium or some other seemingly low-level infraction that the average American will see as a traffic violation. 4 years from now, this story will be off the front page. Everyone but us is going to be thinking of something else. Gas will be under $2, and oh, wait a minute, the Holocaust is 4 more years removed from people's minds. Can we really expect the American people to loudly and unanimously demand a response for a violation that only a few scientists or military strategists will truly understand? A response that may include a war. Now, in the spring of 1936, the Germans openly broke the Versailles and Locarno treaties. They remilitarized the Rhineland by moving 19 battalions into the region. And as things stood that summer, the French, they had a full 100 infantry divisions on their side of the border. They held a staggering military advantage. Now, whether the French were simply too cowardly to attack, as William Shire famously argued in his book, The Fall of the Third Republic, or whether the French declined to attack because they just couldn't stomach the economic cost of war, or whether they didn't attack just because 1936 was an election year, it doesn't make a difference. The bottom line is Europe did nothing when a few thousand German troops carried some guns into an area they promised to stay away from. Now, had Europe upheld the language of those agreements signed 17 and 11 years earlier, had they squashed instantly violation, it would have ultimately saved the lives of 25 million people, including 6 million Jews. And that's with Germany not having nuclear weapons at its disposal. So here we are on Yom Kippur, 5776, the Day of Judgment. Our nuclear deal is in place, and our house is divided. And soon America's focus on Iran, a regime that only 2 weeks ago publicly pledged to the world that it would rid it of Israel within 25 years, that focus will dwindle. And as the agreement unfolds, CNN and Fox and everything in between will shift attention and shower its audiences with Donald Trump clips or stories of refugees or shootings or racism, because no one, and I mean no one, will want to hear about or care about the science of centrifuges or Iran sidestepping the fine print of the deal. But if we remain silent at this time, will relief and deliverance arise for the Jews from somewhere else? When the Iran deal has gone from the front page to the recycling bin, the Jewish future of our children and grandchildren will depend upon our courage to speak out, to speak loudly as Iran continues its game of chess and positions itself to destroy the Jewish people. When Iran challenges the language of the deal and makes a seemingly arbitrary move, one that will inevitably be underreported and unnoticed by the American public, the Jewish future of our children and grandchildren will depend upon our courage to remind the world that the Iranians are thinking 5 moves and 20 years ahead, and arbitrary today is checkmate for the Jews tomorrow. My friends, this is too serious an issue for us to remain a house divided, too serious an issue for us to allow politics to prevent us from agreeing on what is right for the Jews, too serious of an issue for us to fall back into routine as Iran vacates the headlines to make room for a presidential election. If we remain silent at this time, our children and our grandchildren will never forgive us. Gemar Chatima Tova.